Hello, everybody. My name is Dr. Andrew Neville, and we are coming to you live for a Q&A on adrenal fatigue, everything is and is not. We're going to try to dispel some myths, try to challenge some confusion, talk about this mysterious, unfortunately, largely confused and controversial subject, which is adrenal fatigue. And stick around because the answers may surprise you a little bit. There's a fair amount of controversy about adrenal fatigue, and essentially what we want to do is try to make some sense of it all. There's a lot of information on the internet, whether that's from lay people, from PhDs, from medical doctors, from alternative practitioners. Some of it's accurate and a lot of it is not, unfortunately. So every couple of weeks, we're doing these Q&As, both on Facebook and on YouTube, to try to get some accurate information about adrenal fatigue. So I've got a list of questions. People have submitted questions early on. I have that list of questions that I'm going to go after. But as you join in, please do let us know who you are, where you're from. First and foremost, we'd like to hear that. My team is manning the comments, so we'd like to get that information from you. But if you have any questions or comments or whatever that may be, please put them in the comments section, and we're happy to address those as we move forward. I'm gonna kind of the priority as far as the questions goes, go to the people that are in one of the programs that we use to treat adrenal fatigue. We've been treating adrenal fatigue for over 20 years myself, but even my predecessor was doing it for over 30 years prior to me coming here and working with him. So we're happy to jump into those things. Again, comments, questions, please let us know. So I'm going to jump in because there's a fair amount of questions. As always, I'll do everything I can to try to get to those as expeditiously as I can, while my team tries to keep my long-winded answers somewhat shorter. So without further ado, Krista says, can adrenal fatigue cause fibromyalgia? Diagnosed with it in 2021. What can I do to reverse all of this? All right, so this is a fantastic question. There is an incredibly strong connection between adrenal fatigue and fibromyalgia. Fibromyalgia is just terribly kind of understood out there in conventional medicine. Essentially what it is somebody with chronic pain, sometimes transitory pain, sometimes relatively consistent, and they've been through conventional doctors and nobody can really figure out the why, right? The organic reason why. Now, I'm going to tell you the why in a second, but that's one of the biggest issues, right? So to get diagnosed with fibromyalgia, it's basically 4 pounds of pressure on 11 out of 18 tender points. Usually that comes through a rheumatologist. We've ruled out everything else that can cause this pain. Now you have fibromyalgia. So what does that mean? What do we do about that? They don't know. They don't know. Antidepressants is basically what they tend to put people on, which doesn't really get to the root of the problem, the cause of the problem, nor does it fix it, and comes with some side effects as well on top of that. What adrenal fatigue is, is more than just a problem with your adrenal gland, and this is one of the big points, which is really important. Adrenal fatigue is really a dysfunction within somebody's stress response system. And that involves your adrenal glands for sure, right? The adrenals ultimately produce your main stress hormones, your cortisol and adrenaline. Those are kind of the most famous stress hormones, although there's some others kind of up in the brain. There's a hormone side of your stress response system that ends in the adrenals, releasing those stress hormones. But there's also a nerve side of your stress response system, which is technically called your autonomic nervous system. Think of autonomic as automatic. Basically, it's the part of our nervous system that we don't really have to think about, the part of the nervous system that controls our organs. Fairly simple part of the nervous system. Ultimately, 2 nerves coming from the brain going to every organ. One is a stress physiology nerve. They call that your sympathetic part of your nervous system speed up the heart like a tiger just jumped out at you. The other nerve is the opposite, more what we refer to as rest and digest, parasympathetic, more vacation mode, not stress response, right? So speed up the heart or slow down the heart. Essentially, it's that basic, right? Same with the gut, right? Turn it off, turn it on, that kind of thing. Neither of those two parts of your stress response actually calls the shots. The CEO of that stress response is a step above what we call the hypothalamus, which is part of that hormone system in the brain. And in there is things called the hippocampus, the amygdala, little parts of that limbic system, but it works together. That limbic system is constantly assessing your environment for danger. It's always assessing your external environment, receiving information from senses and perception. It's assessing your internal environment, receiving information from chemicals in the blood supply. So when the limbic system receives that information, it's just got to react. It's not a thinking part of our brain. It just reacts. Is this stimulus harmful, dangerous? Can this thing kill me? Do I got to jump this body into fight or flight? Hormones, nerves. Or is it the opposite? It's harmless, innocuous. I can just chill out in vacation mode and just let it pass. Well, what happens is, with a bit of a predisposition, genetic predisposition, and just enough chronic stress over time to overwhelm those genetics, that limbic system starts to get trigger happy and it starts to overperceive its environment as dangerous. So what happens at that point is our body starts to get stuck a little too often in stress physiology or fight or flight mode, releasing too much cortisol and adrenaline in the early stages of this. And it's that excess cortisol and adrenaline which wreaks havoc on the body, just causes all kinds of wear and tear. And the theme with regard to adrenal fatigue and stress is basically what will save your life short term will cause problems if you extend that. So long-term activation of stress response is going to cause some damage. That's what leads to these primary symptoms we associate with adrenal fatigue, pain, weight, insomnia, brain fog, anxiety, depression, even blood pressure and blood sugar issues can all come from too much stress hormone over time. When the limbic system gets sensitized, and we call that central sensitization in the literature, central for central nervous system, it gets sensitized so that minor stressors don't generate a minor response anymore, right? Minor stress, major response. So now we start to get stuck in fight or flight. That sensitization also happens in the rest of the nervous system. There's plenty of research out there showing what cortisol and adrenaline does to the entire nervous system, but even the sensory nerves. And I am talking about fibromyalgia. I'm getting there. It's long-winded, but I'm getting there. When you increase or sensitize your sensory nerves, you're going to have problems, right, with kind of overstimulation, right? So a lot of my patients come into me and they're like, Doc, I'm kind of sensitive to these bright lights and loud sounds bother me, harsh chemicals and smells, even touch. Somebody can just touch one of my patients, right? And that limbic system can register that as pain, which ultimately can turn into fibromyalgia. It's this increased sensitization within the nervous system, right? Sending signals to that limbic system, which kind of initiates this sensation of pain, for just minor stimuli. And it can be everywhere and anywhere. And it can come, it can go, all that stuff, right? So it's that sensitization of the nervous system that causes problems. Now, Chris always still asks, what can I do to reverse all this? Well, there's no magic medication or magic bullet or magic supplement that I can recommend to reverse all this, but there absolutely is a process. When you address this at its root cause, right, which is a dysfunctional stress response system, including the adrenals, not only, but including the adrenals, when you target that whole system, the hormone side, the nerve side, the brain part of this, in an effort to kind of calm it down, settle it down, and then support and balance it, You absolutely can get ahead of it. Absolutely can get ahead of it. But it's got to be comprehensive, and we have to address it on multiple levels, which includes lifestyle modifications. It includes dietary interventions. Yes, supplements, vitamins, things like that. There's a lot that we can do to help to calm and settle this system over time. But ultimately, when you shift this physiology back into balance and stop causing all that damage from cortisol and adrenaline, those symptoms, little by little by little, incrementally, they just go away. They start to decrease in intensity, in frequency, and duration. It takes a little time, but when you put enough of the pieces of the puzzle there for everybody, you can absolutely get this to balance, and that fibromyalgia can go away. So you can treat it. You just got to do it in a comprehensive way. And we've kind of fine-tuned what we do and how we approach this over the course of several decades, essentially. So I see that there's more people joining on. Please let us know where you're from. If you got any questions or comments with regard to adrenal fatigue, what it is, what it isn't, what you've read somewhere, or my doctor says it doesn't exist, whatever, throw that out at us, because we're trying to get as much accurate information about this condition as we possibly can. Okay? Okay, Joey says, what advice would you offer the first responder community when in fact most of their career comes with stress in all forms, especially mental and physical? You push yourself physically daily, deal with so many stressors. So how do you handle this? Or should someone prone to this condition find another profession? Okay, Joey. So our bodies are not designed to not have stress. And I kind of give stress a bad rap most of the time. Stress is not all bad. There's good stress, there's bad stress. The challenge comes when we have enough stress over time that our system that responds to that stress, it gets trigger happy and it gets stuck. I view stress a little differently than most people. We all have one stress response system, right? This same physiology, right? Hormones, nerves, limbic system in the brain. So to me, that means this system has to deal with any and all stress that we're presented with. So I picture it like a bucket. Now, we all have a certain size bucket of tolerance for stress, genetically, right? Half from mom, half from dad. There's your bucket. Some small, some big. But you can overwhelm anybody's bucket if you throw enough at them over time. But this bucket doesn't discriminate. So it's got to deal with any and all stress, whether it's physical, mental, emotional, spiritual, social stress, toxins in the environment, diet and nutrition, bad infections or injuries, especially head injuries, accidents, inflammatory responses, but past trauma, abuse, and life, right? Whether it's your job or traffic or family or social media, politics, it all goes into the same bucket. We're not meant to live a life where that bucket is empty. Nobody has that. In fact, we'd wither up and die if we didn't have some stimulation on this system. The problem comes about when that bucket is overflowing, and that's when we get stuck, and that's where the damage comes from. So what we have to do when we're working together to get after this is, for each individual person, figure out a way to create space in someone's bucket. Now, there's two ways to do that. Two primary ways. One of the ways is pay attention to what's in your bucket, right? If there's anything we can control, anything we can scoop out of that bucket, that's a useful thing. You don't have to empty it. Just create some space. So now there's tolerance, and we can start loosening up this physiology. What you can also do is expand the bucket. You expand the bucket by healing the stress response system, right? By targeting the hormones, the nerves, the limbic system, heal it, desensitize it, right? Essentially making it bigger. So now there's increased tolerance as well. And as far as somebody's job goes, certain jobs are more prone to stress than other jobs, of course, right? That's the way it's going to be. if somebody's going to take on a job, whatever that job may be, we have to assume, okay, that that's going to be a certain amount that's in that bucket. So what that means is we just want to pay extra attention to the other stuff that's in that bucket, right? So we want to make sure some of the other lifestyle variables are there. We want to make sure that we're, ultimately poking as many holes in that bucket to drain out stress, which goes to coping mechanisms and spending time in nature and cognitive behavioral techniques to reframe things and working on those coping skills, relaxation exercise, those kinds of things. So as the bucket fills up, we have things that drain, right? That could be exercise to a degree, not over exercising. It could be social connections. There's a lot of ways to get at kind of lowering that level in the bucket as well, while we're scooping out, while we're healing and making it bigger. So it's not that you have to quit your job. Most of the time, my patients don't have to do that. Some do choose to choose a different profession at times. It's looking at this in totality, which basically enables us to get ahead of it. And when you do it in a comprehensive way, you can. So it shouldn't be that you can't, be a first responder and make that effort. It's just that you got to pay attention to some of these other stressors as well. Okay, so we got a couple other questions coming in, which is awesome. I will do what I can to get to those. Marcia says, do naturopaths have journals where they combine the best of all their research, or is each clinic just relying on its own conclusion? And if so, why don't they collaborate? That's a good question, Marcia. Back when I was in school, in naturopathic medical school out in Seattle, I did plenty of time in the library. I ended up doing a bunch of research, which ended up kind of assisting my process because I was able to find my predecessor's book all about adrenal fatigue and finally start figuring out what was going on with me. But I was digging into tons and tons of research. And there was a journal back then, as 20 some years ago, which was the Journal of Naturopathic Medicine. So they put out some decent research and some information. I don't know why, but that journal is now defunct. So there are a variety of publications, right, where naturopaths are kind of talking about different ways to treat different conditions. There's a handful of them out there, but most of the time, the research that I look at, and I look at research on a daily basis, it comes from a variety of sources, and that's especially true for adrenal fatigue, which is unfortunate, but that's the way it goes. I have to go and search in endocrinologic texts and journals, right? I have to look at the neuroscience literature. We have to look at the metabolic literature because stress physiology causes oxidative stress, which causes mitochondrial dysfunction. So now we got to know about that. What can we do about those kinds of things? This stress physiology also causes problems on this other side of this physiologic seesaw, because when your body internally is busy fighting tigers, you're metabolically turning on the organs that would save your life, right? So your heart and your lungs and some metabolism. But at the same time, you're suppressing some other pretty important stuff chronically, primarily immune, digestive, reproductive, thyroid. All right, so now we got to dig into that literature, the immunologic literature. I mean, we know just kind of inherently, right, that when I get stressed, I get sick. Or when I get stressed, I get a cold sore, like a viral reactivation. Well, that's all that immunosuppression stuff that happens. But now we got to look at the gastroenterologic literature, right, and dig, into that aspect. We've got to look at the psychiatric literature, the psychological literature. So, unfortunately, especially with this condition, we have to kind of pick and choose from all these diverse journals and kind of synthesize it and put it all together to be able to guide patients. And, my task, in the near future is to kind of write all this down and be able to document it in a way kind of similar to what my predecessor did to try to get it all out there. So I wish, Marcia, that there was one central repository, but it doesn't really exist. From a treatment perspective, now we've got to look at different journals, right? There's plenty of research, Japanese or Chinese medicine, right, that looks at different herbs and things, right? There's nutritional research, right, that we have to dig into. And unfortunately, a lot of times we got to go out. We got to kind of go away from the United States and that literature to be able to get, a better volume of literature. Because some of those other countries, their government funds that in the same way they fund pharmaceutical types of research or conventional research. I wish I had a better answer for you, Marcia, but that's where we're at. Okay, welcome everybody. Let's see. So just let us know where you're from, who you are, if you've got any questions, concerns. So we're talking about adrenal fatigue and all its connectedness. So Reese is asking, symptoms of long COVID sound just like those of adrenal fatigue. It's a good point. Do the same healing methods work on prolonged COVID? So long COVID, right? Long COVID is another one of these kind of post-viral syndromes, right? And it's very common in patients with adrenal fatigue to have maybe a little worse problem with COVID because of that immune system suppression, right? And have this tendency towards long COVID. There are many names over the years that doctors and different people have given to adrenal fatigue. One of those names is chronic fatigue syndrome, right? So one of the main underlying causes you'll find with chronic fatigue syndrome is adrenal fatigue, this dysfunction over time, chronically, actively kind of running internally running from tigers all the time is incredibly debilitating. We get that mitochondrial dysfunction, production of ATP is compromised. Powerful research showing the mitochondrial dysfunction that happens because of stress physiology. If that gets bad enough, you can be chronically fatigued enough to be diagnosed with chronic fatigue syndrome by CDC criteria. Well, that name came about, I think it's in the early 90s at this point. But they also used to call this post-viral illness, post-Epstein-Barr. The yuppie flu was one that they would have called it because of this strong connection with chronic viruses hanging on without, in my opinion, enough attention to the reason why, because those chronic viral reactivations just come from the immunosuppression with stress physiology over time. So in my experience, and in my opinion, long COVID is more of the same. I think what you're dealing with is, so now we've got this coronavirus, which is a significant virus and significant infection for many, for sure. But for most people, right, for a lot of people, the immune system can respond. It's not that big of a deal. And then it's not a problem, especially a chronic problem. In some patients, they develop this long COVID kind of syndrome, which you accurately noted. Those symptoms are kind of similar to adrenal fatigue because it's pretty much the same thing to a large degree. It's essentially one of these post-viral syndromes where we have a bunch of the population whose bucket was fuller than maybe it should be. They got hit with this straw that breaks the camel's back, and that could be COVID. But historically, if I'm, looking back at my patients, that could have been a car accident. That could have been some other trauma. It could be, a death in the family. Could be menopause or some hormonal change. There's a lot that could be that last straw. But for a lot of the country, it was, we're running a little hot on stress physiology, too often, too long, straw that breaks the camel's back. Now that thing is really stuck and broken. So my treatment efforts are really very much the same. Comprehensive treatment, get to this underlying cause, shift this physiology, and now you're not, from an immune perspective, you're not suppressing your immune system all the time. The immune system can kick in and finally kind of eradicate this, and the body can finally heal and repair. Our bodies know how to heal, right? Our body's been healing from all kinds of things for thousands of years. But when our physiology is stuck here, we're not geared up for healing, right? We're geared up for survival, right? Energy, fight the tiger kind of a thing from a physiologic perspective, a genetic perspective. It's all about fight or flight. Well, the rest and digest, which is where all the healing and repair side of things, that's just suppressed, right? Turn that on, and now you have the capacity to heal from just about anything. It's powerful. It's powerful. Okay, Gwen says, I have several autoimmune conditions, Hashimoto's, lupus, Graves'. Hashimoto's and Graves'. That's interesting because one is hyperthyroid, one is hypothyroid, regardless. And I'm struggling to find a doctor to explain why this is happening. Is there an adrenal connection? 100%, Gwen. And again, it goes back, we're just talking about long COVID. We're talking about stress physiology, AKA adrenal fatigue, causing immunosuppression. Well, it's not quite that simple. The immune system, nothing is, right? The immune system is fairly complex, but in general, there's a bit of a shift that happens in the immune system. And what happens in that shift, technically, at least in the research, they call this a Th1 to Th2 shift. Th1 side stands for T helper cells, just a part of your immune system. The Th1 side of your immune system fights infection, especially inside cells, viruses, yeast, parasites, things like that. The Th2 side is the side that creates antibodies to things. And they work together, and in balance, we need both in balance. When you hit the immune system with stress hormone over time, this Th1 to Th2 shift reveals or causes the Th1 side to be somewhat suppressed. So now we're a little more vulnerable to frequent infections, recurrent infections, this post-viral stuff, long COVID, chronic sinus, things like that. And when the Th2 side is overactivated, now we're increasing antibody production. And that could be antibody production to anything. It could be the environment, right? So environmental allergies, hay fever type stuff. It could be food, right? So now we see increased food sensitivities. But if you're increasing antibody production, it could be to anything. It could be potentially to your body's own tissue. Now, it depends on where those autoantibodies, they call those, where those antibodies attack as to what name we give each individual autoimmune condition, right? If it's the joints, it's rheumatoid arthritis. If it's the thyroid, it's Hashimoto's or Graves'. It could be salivary glands and skin, and now it's Sjogren's, and you name it. It could be the spine and ankylosing spondylitis. I have yet to see a patient who had an autoimmune disease who did not have this underlying adrenal problem and subsequent immunosuppression. To get ahead of that, right? The key is not even necessarily to chase after the immune system, because the immune system is just doing what it's told. It's this underlying physiologic shift, right? The fact that we're stuck in stress physiology, we balance that out, right? We shift that over time. And now that Th1 to Th2 shift balances back out. And now you lose that tendency to increase antibody production. Those antibodies come down over time. It's a little more complex than that. I mean, if anybody's, we're splitting hairs, but there's Th17, there's Th9, there's a bunch of other things in the immune system, but in general, that's what we do. And I see it work. I see it work all the time. Just the other day, one of my patients, she has Sjogren's, and she had gone back to her rheumatologist and her other doctors. And, she shared with me, she's like, my doctors they're amazed at the shift, right? That my condition is not progressing. It's actually improving. They have these markers where they can look at, certainly antibodies and salivary response, things like that. That's what Sjogren's hits. And they don't know they don't know why, right? So they're just saying, well, whatever you're doing with this guy, keep doing it because things are doing better. So this does happen, and you can get ahead of autoimmune conditions. You just have to treat it at a deeper level. That's the biggest thing. Okay. Erica says, let me see where we're at. All right. Erica says, hi, Dr. Neville. So regarding the hyperglycemic diet, hypo is kind of what we're talking about. What if you have a hard time breaking down fat? Can you do a low fat hyperglycemic? Okay, so hyper, high, hypo, low, right? So one of the things the adrenal gland does, cortisol, one of its primarily jobs is to control your blood sugar. Every time your blood sugar drops, like if you were to miss a meal for some reason, well, your adrenals are stimulated. They well, they don't sense it, but they have to release cortisol. Cortisol goes to the liver, tells it to release a stored form of sugar into the blood so you don't pass out from low blood sugar, right? So that's a stress. Every time that happens, right, that's a stress in the bucket. The adrenals have to deal with your blood sugar. So one of the common, or I would say necessary, right, one of the necessary dietary recommendations is to eat a hypoglycemic diet, technically low sugar diet, but yeah, so hypoglycemic diet has three main tenets: small frequent meals, more protein and fat, low sugar and carb. Just stabilize, just make sure that blood sugar doesn't drop, right? Now, that kind of a diet is a more nutrient dense diet, right? We're increasing protein and fat, right? Because that just stabilizes the sugar. Because carbs, right? Sugar and carbs, they raise the sugar quickly and then they come crashing down. Now we want more sugar and carbs, right? That's why you can't eat just one chip or whatever it is, right? So the body's wired that way. So we want to have less of those, but more protein and fat. Protein and fat's a little more nutrient dense. So now people have to eat a little more nutrient dense diet on a digestive system that's suppressed from the same underlying problem, right? Suppressing digestion, especially along the lines of not being able to digest those more nutrient dense things. So the key moving forward is small meals, right? So smaller meals are going to be easier to digest, right? Your digestion's suppressed, so we'll give it smaller meals. The thing is, if you're eating smaller meals, you're going to run out of fuel faster. So we got to tighten up the meal times, right? That's the big thing, right? So minimally, it's 3 meals a day. Better yet, like a meal snack pattern: small breakfast, snack, small lunch, snack, small dinner, even a snack before bed, which actually helps the blood sugar overnight. Because everybody's blood sugar drops overnight, right? Like we eat dinner, you're going to go around the clock 12 hours, right? 7 o'clock, eat dinner, whatever it is. You're going to get up at 7, have breakfast. That's 12 hours without taking in any food. Your body's got to keep your blood sugar up, and it relies on your adrenals to do that. Well, for most people, that's a minor stress. They generate a minor response, and we sleep right through it. For my patients, we make mountains out of molehills, right? The limbic system over responds. So it's minor stress, blood sugar drops, minor stress, major response. Now we can wake up wide awake at night just because our blood sugar dropped. So the key here is to keep the meals small, a couple of bites of protein with a little. So animal protein comes with protein and fat, right? Animal products. You might have to manipulate that. You might not be able to tolerate certain fats, at least in the beginning, until your digestive strength strengthens. So overall, hypoglycemic diet, but the key is to listen to your body, right? Listen to your body. That's one of the big things. Don't eat in a way that makes you feel poorly, right? At times, my patients, their digestion is so suppressed, we've got to resort to like protein shakes initially, right? Put a little bit of fat in there, a little coconut oil or nut butters or things like that. And you can do it. You can balance your blood sugar if you're not eating animal protein. You can. I have some patients that are, vegetarian or even vegan, and you can do it. It's just a little harder to balance it that way. Okay. So yes, you can do it. Again, hypoglycemic diet is one of the key components of treatment. Very key. Okay. So I have a question from Marianne. Marianne says, I was told that I have a wasting syndrome due to the high cortisol rushes. Can't sleep, can't gain weight, fatigued all the time, food anxieties, certain foods trigger the anxiety, cortisol tests are normal. Let's see. 0.1 over thyroid. They say I'm hypothyroid, yet I weigh 90 pounds, 5'9", 60 years old. Okay, so when your physiology is here, right, and you're in stress physiology, metabolically, there's a few things that happen. When you're dumping that excess cortisol, it's not just about cortisol. So this is the first thing, Marianne. It's not just about cortisol. It's also about adrenaline and even some of the other stress hormones. There's pituitary stress hormones, hypothalamic stress hormones, which are just harder to measure. So we look at cortisol because it's accessible at least. But when we're in stress physiology, it's going to lead to weight problems the majority of the time. I'd say 80% of my patients are weight gainers. And there's a few different mechanisms as to why that happens. A lot of us have seen the cortisol and belly fat commercials, like late night TV, right? Cortisol causes belly fat. Certainly that happens. But there's also the 20% that are weight losers, right? And what happens is when we're in fight or flight, the body is mobilizing energy. We get into what we call a catabolic state. We're breaking down everything we eat. We're not storing anything. We're burning it for fuel. In fact, we're even breaking down other tissue like muscle protein, things like that, fat, glycogen stores. We're breaking those down for fuel at a rapid clip, right? To be able to use that fuel to fight this tiger that must be there. So patients in that situation will tend to be on the weight losing side. The key here, right, is not necessarily to chase after the weight. I don't chase after the weight gainers. I don't chase after the weight losers. The key is to focus on this underlying physiology, because when you get that physiology to shift, now you have this balance between a catabolic state and what we call an anabolic state, right, which is, building muscle, repairing, things like that. We have to strike that balance. So whether your cortisols are normal, I'm not sure what testing you did for cortisol. We tend to do salivary cortisol testing because it measures the free hormone. I don't know if there's a question here, but when you test for this, conventional doctors will generally test blood levels of cortisol. Blood levels of cortisol includes all the cortisol in the body, which means bound cortisol and free cortisol. Bound cortisol doesn't really do anything. Bound hormone in general doesn't really do anything. And about 95% of the cortisol in the body is bound, which only leaves about 5% free, which is active and doing stuff. So you might need to kind of get away from conventional testing and look towards more alternative testing. We use saliva testing for this. A 4-point saliva test can usually tell us what we want to know about cortisol. If you're stuck in a place where you're having rushes, right, or anxiety, right, no matter what anybody says on testing, you're dumping extra stress hormone, right? So that's the key, is to get out of that pattern, right? And again, I wish I could recommend like an anti-anxiety medication, right, or an anti-anxiety herb or something like that. It really is much more involved than that. And I've got kind of one primary program that I've got at this point, which is my Core Plus program, which is run by coaches, which offers kind of this guidance, right, from a lifestyle, dietary kind of supplement, things like that. But in an effort to help people really understand this and get the support they need to get ahead of it. You've all read about adrenal fatigue, and there's articles that are written out there, but they tend to be kind of the same old static bit of information, which just doesn't work for the majority of people. It's a more complex problem than just a problem with your adrenals. You have to have somebody who's looking at the hormones, the nerves, especially that limbic system in the brain, and dealing with this in a more comprehensive way. So if you're interested in finding out more information about that, by all means, shoot us a note in the comments. My team can give you information, because I've got patient coordinators who are there to talk to you, free consultation, right? Free call to talk to you about, whether or not this is a fit, if it makes sense. But that's really what you have to go after, right? You have to go after that physiologic shift. You will be hypothyroid, by the way. You will be, because that's what stress hormone does. It goes and suppresses your thyroid, which doesn't always lead to weight gain. So don't get too caught up in that. Okay, and all my best. I know it's challenging and it's confusing, and that's kind of why we do these. We do these live events to try to get that. To get some more accurate information out there. Okay, I've got a couple questions here I want to do in a bit of a rapid response style, because my team says I'm too long-winded. Here we go. Pauline says, is there any connection between PCOS and adrenal fatigue? Absolutely. PCOS or polycystic ovarian syndrome is a problem within the hypothalamic pituitary ovarian hormone axis. You get a shift in the ovarian hormones, a tendency towards more androgens or male hormones. which also causes some metabolic problems. So we see insulin problems, we see weight gain. You might not have to actually have ovarian cysts in PCOS, strangely, but it's more than that. One of the big controllers of your hypothalamic pituitary ovarian hormone axis is actually your adrenals. As goes your adrenals, so too will go your ovaries and your thyroid. And I've had numerous patients who were once diagnosed with PCOS. Once we shifted this physiology, that PCOS little by little goes away. So you want to treat that underlying cause, and the adrenals are quite often that underlying cause. Faith says, which supplements do you recommend for frequent urination? Frequent urination is an incredibly common symptom of adrenal fatigue, quite simply because one of the jobs the adrenal has is to help you to hold on to salt, right? It's a different hormone, not cortisol, but aldosterone. Help you hold on to salt, and in the body, water follows salt. So if your adrenals are weak, you can't hold on to salt, you can't hold on to water, which is why my patients will urinate frequently. First and foremost, right? Eat more salt, right? Salt gets a bad rap in society today, but salt is incredibly important. Primarily that's sodium. It works in every cell. It's absolutely crucial. And if you're urinating frequently, it means your sodium levels are going to be on the low side, which means you're kind of grinding just about all cells to a halt. So the first thing you need to do is try to get in more salt. I'll start with having to get an unrefined sea salt and have people put that on their food, a little bit in water. Could be, a quarter teaspoon once, twice a day, sometimes more. There is a supplement that can also help with this called licorice root, which has an aldosterone-like effect. But you would want testing and you want to get some assessment before you would start that. Casey says, what's your take on let's try that again. Casey says, what's your take on using meds for high cholesterol? Cholesterol, in my opinion, is like a check engine light in the body. And when cholesterol goes up, it means there's something going on. It could be inflammation, could be stress. Every one of your stress hormones is actually made from cholesterol. One of the number one reasons even for increasing cholesterol levels is actually stress physiology, because we get stressed. The liver knows it's got to make more cholesterol, get it to the adrenals, turn that into cortisol so you can fight that tiger. Do we want to artificially suppress that? No. There are many more risk factors to cardiovascular risk factors beyond cholesterol. I tend to use it as a check engine light and as a bit of a warning sign. So I'm not a big fan of artificially lowering cholesterol levels like everybody goes after. It's a much more complicated conversation than that. And what I often see is when we shift this physiology, those cholesterol levels take care of themselves. Megan says, what low-cost recommendations do you suggest for healing adrenal fatigue? All right. Low-cost recommendations for healing adrenal fatigue. There are some. I already mentioned the hyperglycemic diet. That's just eating a certain way, putting less stress on your adrenals. What you can also do is try to turn on rest and digest physiology. And this is pretty much all low cost. Turn on rest and digest physiology. The number one way to do that is with some form of a consistent mind focusing relaxation exercise, whether that's deep breathing, guided imagery, visualization, meditation, repetitive prayer. It doesn't really matter what it is. Focus on one thing, which nobody can do, right? But you try to focus on one thing, your mind's going to go away, you bring it back. What that does is it starts to rewire your limbic system, settle it down so it's not so trigger happy. You're not stimulating all that cortisol. Hypoglycemic diet, relaxation exercise. The other side of that would be turning on the vagus nerve. So vagus nerve exercises, all low cost. And Samantha says, does endometriosis cause adrenal fatigue? So endometriosis is a problem of what we refer to as estrogen dominance, right? And again, I said the control of your hypothalamic pituitary ovarian hormones is largely in the hands of your stress physiology. So the majority of my female patients have a tendency towards estrogen dominance. You're just throwing off the ratio of estrogen to progesterone. In susceptible women, that can turn into certainly PMS or heavier bleeding, but also fibroids, even endometriosis, which is where that endometrium is outside the uterine lining, which is where it should not be. When you control the when you control the estrogen dominance, that endometriosis tends to go away on its own as well. Certainly endometriosis itself causes pain, which pain is a stress. So there's a vicious cycle with it, but underlying the endometriosis, right, is quite often adrenal fatigue and a dysfunctional stress response system. Okay. Lily says, is there a difference between adrenal fatigue, adrenal dysfunction, and dysautonomia? Why are there so many names for what seems like the same thing? Excuse me, Lily, I am with you. I'm not a big fan of the name adrenal fatigue for this condition. In fact, I would suggest there's no good name for this condition. The most accurate name for this thing that we call adrenal fatigue, the most accurate name, though, is a stress response system dysfunction. When I say that, I'm using all of the stress response. So is it the adrenals and the adrenal dysfunction? Yes, but that's just the hormone side of that dysfunction. Is it dysautonomia, which technically is an imbalance in your autonomic nervous system? 100% it is, right? But it's also an imbalance in your limbic system, right? So you can call it by any one of these things, and a lot of doctors do. Right? A lot of doctors will chase after, hey, you have autonomic nervous system problems, POTS, orthostatic intolerance, whatever. You have dysautonomia, that's your problem. And they're right, but not only. Some doctors will focus purely on the adrenals, right? Look, cortisol, DHEA, and they're right, but not only. Some doctors will even take pictures of your brain and tell you, well, you have hippocampal atrophy or you have problems within your limbic system. And they're right too, but not only. What I found is the most effective way to get ahead of this adrenal fatigue thing, for the lack of a better name at this point, is to treat all that, right, at the same time. And also not get caught up in chasing after what I would consider the secondary and tertiary dysfunctions, right? A lot of doctors will chase after the symptoms. Right? Let's treat the pain. Let's treat the weight, the insomnia, the anxiety, chase after those symptoms. Even if you pick the right drug or herb, to me, it's like putting a little piece of tape over the check engine light in your car, because you might not have anxiety anymore, but you haven't fixed this underlying physiologic problem. Right? You could try to chase after the immune, digestive, reproductive, and thyroid problems. A lot of people make a living after doing that because they do that. And again, to me, because your body is suppressing those, it's like trying to push a car that has the parking brake engaged. Boy, it's a whole lot more effective to release that brake by finally shifting this physiology. I wish there was a better name. I wish there was less confusion, but that's what we're looking at, Lily. Okay, Joe says, what does abusing alcohol for many years do to the limbic system? 9 months, no drinking. Just wondering about how much of a positive effect this has on healing, since I think it was definitely one of the main stressors. For sure, alcohol causes damage. I mean, it's a central nervous system depressant, works on, manipulating certain neurotransmitters, GABA, things like that. The bigger problem is not necessarily the alcohol itself, it's the need for the alcohol, right? So many people will self-medicate, right, for adrenal fatigue. If you see somebody who needs coffee in the morning, don't talk to me until I have my coffee or 4, right? Coffee in the morning, they need things to stabilize themselves during the day. Energy drinks, could be nicotine, could be cigarettes, things like that. And then at night, they need something to calm them down. Give me a couple glasses of wine or a 6-pack of beer, whatever it is. These people are basically self-medicating for the imbalances that we see with a dysfunctional stress response or adrenal fatigue. Fix that. fix that problem, then the need for the alcohol or some of these other self-medicating things, that need goes down, and then eventually you can get away from those things. Alcohol is a problem. It causes damage. There's really no safe levels of alcohol depending on who you talk to. But the body can heal from that, right? That's the big thing to know. You shift that physiology, you turn on all that healing and repair, and absolutely it balances out and it heals the brain from any damage that's done. Okay. Debbie says, this may be off topic. Okay, we can do that. This may be off topic, but I have all sorts of triggers since getting the vaccine. I'm trying to detox it out of me, but it may be too late. I now have psoriasis on my scalp, lupus symptoms. I do yoga, increasing meditation. Limbic system is definitely overloaded. And most of us, sure, the pandemic itself causes stress, anxiety. Sure. Thanks for your insights. So the thing is, the vaccines in general are affect the immune system, right? So that's the big thing. And different people have different tolerances to that effect. But if I look globally, right, at people with vaccines, most of the time the vaccines don't cause a problem, right? So my question would be, if you had a problem with the vaccine, if it's the same vaccine in everybody, but you had a problem, then there's something within your physiology, right, or your metabolic makeup that makes you vulnerable to whatever that trigger is. And in my opinion, quite commonly, that's going to be this physiology, right? Because when we're in stress physiology, we end up suppressing immune, digestive, reproductive. When you suppress the immune system, your immune system is not going to behave like everybody else's immune system. So I see vaccine reactions in my patients, but it goes back even to, there's a common question about Epstein-Barr, right? Epstein-Barr is a herpes family virus. You test 95% of the country. We all test positive for having had Epstein-Barr at some point. Usually childhood, teenage years, kissing, mono, that kind of a thing. So in some people, Epstein-Barr reactivates, right? It happened to me, right? But the question, and my doctors, well-intentioned, conventional, mainly, naturopathic alternative doctors, they'd be like, oh, your problems are your Epstein-Barr. And I'd treat it and I'd feel a little better, but then it'd come back right away. And then I realized, if everybody in the country has Epstein-Barr, why is mine reactivating and everybody else's isn't? Same virus. The problem is me, right? It's me. My immune system isn't strong enough to keep Epstein-Barr at bay, because like all herpes viruses, Epstein-Barr never leaves your body. As long as your immune system's strong enough, you can keep it dormant. Okay, so it's my immune system. My immune system isn't strong enough. Why? I tend to drive patients and doctors a little crazy because I'm always asking why. Like, what's the underlying problem? What's the why? Well, that why, the main control of our immune system, stress physiology. Once I was able to shift that physiology, Epstein-Barr is not a problem anymore. I've seen it happen hundreds and hundreds of times. So, okay. All right. So I want to thank everybody for participating in our YouTube poll. We put up a YouTube poll. Feedback's important. Helps us know what we want to concentrate on, what is, mysterious. I talk about this stuff all the time. So I'm never sure, what people are getting, what is confusing, what they need. But the winner of this week's poll is about why the vagus nerve is such an important piece of healing this puzzle, this adrenal fatigue, this adrenal dysfunction, this chronic fatigue, fibromyalgia, stress response system dysfunction. What's with this vagus nerve? All right, so if you go back to the beginning of this conversation, I was talking about the stress response system, which is threefold. Hormones with the adrenals, but the hormones, the nerves, right? Autonomic nervous system, and then the limbic system in the brain. Autonomic nervous system has two sides: fight or flight, rest and digest. Sympathetic, which doesn't mean sympathy, has nothing to do with that. And then there's parasympathetic. The main parasympathetic nerve, or rest and digest nerve in the body, is your vagus nerve. And the vagus nerve has lots of branches. The biggest nerve in our body starts in our brain and it goes to a bunch of organs, even your heart. Mainly, though, your digestive tract. Like that vagus nerve runs your gut, mouth to anus, the whole thing. anytime we turn on the vagus nerve, you're basically turning on your parasympathetics, you're turning on this rest and digest, healing and repair side of your physiology, which is powerful, right? Because our body is defaulted to fight or flight. We as humans are really good at stress physiology, right? That's what we're designed. That's why we are all still here on this earth. So that's our default. So we have to make seemingly heroic efforts to turn on the opposite, this rest and digest physiology. One of those tools are vagus nerve exercises. One of the main researchers, right, who had a theory about the vagus nerve called polyvagal theory, a guy by the name of Stephen Porges, polyvagal theory. He kind of synthesized a bunch of different research, which is essentially what turns on that vagus nerve, and can we turn on that vagus nerve often enough to really lubricate, right, this trigger happy fulcrum, right, that puts us into fight or flight all the time. Can we bring back the fine tuning of that by turning on the vagus nerve? And sure enough, you can. So part of treatment for this, which you now know is there's a lot of parts of treatment for this, but part of that is vagus nerve exercises. One of the main ones is nature. Being present and mindful and present in nature turns on the vagus nerve. Chewing, gargling, humming turns on the vagus nerve. Turns out the most external part of the vagus nerve, there's one way in the back of the throat. So when you vibrate that, you end up turning on that vagus nerve as well. Certain breathing exercises. One of my favorites that turns on the vagus nerve, which they've actually studied, is experiencing awe. Experiencing kind of extreme beauty, essentially. It could be in nature. It could be like architecture or something like that. I mean, it could be even something on your phone, believe it or not. But when you experience that phenomenon of awe, you turn on your vagus nerve. So we just have to do it as much as possible, as often as possible. The one thing I'd caution everybody is to be careful with this idea of cold exposure to fix adrenal fatigue, to fix dysautonomia in patients that are where this is not too much of a problem, right? They're not easily overstimulated. They're maybe they just have moderate levels of problems. They have relative balance. You can use cold exposure, but this kind of fad of cold exposure, we have to be really cautious with in patients with more significant adrenal dysfunction, because it can turn on the sympathetics, turn on fight or flight, and then we get stuck there if we're too trigger happy. So you just want to be cautious about that one. But if you look at Stephen Porges' stuff, polyvagal theory, turning on the vagus nerve is generally a good thing. A good thing. Okay. Monica says, my anxiety is super high and I've been hyperventilating. I have trouble with supplements, meditate 4 times a day, feel like I'm stuck in a vicious circle. What else can I do to help with my anxiety? It's like my body is stuck. I'm sorry to hear that, Monica. Absolutely. Your body is stuck, but not permanently. It's very common, right, for my patients to be sensitive, right? That sensitization happens on so many levels. In fact, my predecessor said at one point that if you had to describe somebody with adrenal problems with one word, that word would be sensitive, right? On so many levels. So supplements sometimes are challenging for sure. There are always ways to get after it. We want to pay attention to the triggers. We want to scoop whatever we can out of the bucket as best we can. We want to do you mentioned the meditation, make sure it's mind focusing. You want to do the mindfulness stuff. You want to do vagus nerve exercises, right? All those various things from a lifestyle dietary perspective. Try to de-stress, try to rest, pace, all those various things are really key. Listen to your body. One of the things I will use if my patients can't tolerate some supplements is sometimes I'll defer to some of these devices that are out there. There are certain devices that are helpful in shifting this physiology. I have tried many of these devices, experimented with them with myself and with patients. I've landed on a handful of them that are more effective than most, simple and easy to do. I will share one of my favorites more recently over the past couple of years is something called Apollo or Apollo Neuro, which is a wearable device on your wrist or your ankle. It uses heart rate variability, trying to help to target the vagus nerve. It's nice and easy to do. I have had a lot of patients who are overly sensitive be able to use that to settle this physiology, and in time, now they start to lose their sensitivity. Now we can start to get some other things into them to help to rebalance, heal, and really come out of this. But you're right, Monica, in that in order to get ahead of this, we've got to shift that physiology. And if you're still stuck in that anxiety place, what we call anxiety, which to me is just a bunch of adrenaline, we've got to make more effort, right, at shifting that physiology. There's always a way to do it. Always a way to do it. So hang in there. Hang in there. Well, we made it through the hour. My team says we're done. I think there's a handful of other questions we didn't get to, which I apologize for. If you have any other questions, concerns, by all means, reach out to us. I've got patient coordinators who are there to talk to people. I've got an assessment tool on my website to see if adrenal fatigue is a thing you might be dealing with. So you can start with that. You can go to my YouTube channel, reach out to us on Facebook, and by all means, like the information, share the information as much as possible. We are just trying to get this information out to as many people as possible. All my best.